They did not feel comfortable talking about this part of history in their classrooms. They didn't know how to discuss it and address it.
This is not just about killing Black people and destroying their homes and businesses. This is about, removing Black people, expelling Black people. An intentional, deliberate, planned assault on a community.
That day, the 19th of May, would always be a day to remember, a frightening, saddening memory to hold by the lineages of those who were there and were told.
The story of the deadliest race massacre in American history begins with two individuals, Dick Rowland and Sarah Page.
These two individuals were the reactionary catalyst that had led to the reasonless outbreak and demonic destruction that brought Tulsa, Oklahoma, to ruins. Dick Rowland was an African-American young struggling male, whereas Sarah Page was a white American privileged female. And as usual in that era, Sarah Page had falsely alleged that Dick Rowland had assaulted her in an elevator where they had both run into each other.
The next day, Tulsa police show up at Dick's home. He's arrested. He's taken downtown to the courthouse, awaiting arraignment.
That could have been the end of the story had it not been for the intervention of the Tulsa Tribune, the daily afternoon newspaper. The Tribune published a story the next day entitled "Nabbed Negro for Attacking Girl in an Elevator." It was a false narrative about an attempted rape in broad daylight in downtown Tulsa.
And as obviously unreal as that may have sounded, all hell would break loose at the news.
The newspaper story is published around 3 o'clock. By 4 o'clock, a small group of white men have begun to assemble around and mill around the courthouse. This goes on for several hours. More and more whites showing up, murmuring about lynching Dick Rowland.
First the crowd is 50, then 100, then 200. Then 300, 400, 500 whites gathered outside of the Tulsa County Courthouse, in whose jail Dick Rowland is held in a top floor jail cell. The crowd wants the sheriff to turn over the prisoner because they're going to kill him. They're going to lynch him.
That Dick Rowland was, at this point in the hands of the authorities, was not enough for these hateful white fanatics. All they wanted yet again was to spill the innocent blood of another Black skin. And on seeing Black vets come armed to the venue to make sure that nothing happens in the long run, these white mobs ran haywire.
They go nuts. Members of the mob run home to get their own guns.
And not only came back with weapons, brought others with them.
The mob is getting bigger, 600, 700, 800 people, armed, angry.
By this time, the crowd has grown to nearly 2,000, if not more.
And then, in the words of the sheriff, all hell broke loose.
And the worst single incident of racial violence in American history begins.
And it was death, coming from the mouth of nukes. Bombs being dropped on an entire hood like it was inconsequential, like it was nothing, like there were no human beings beneath.
What had been one of the wealthiest communities, most educated communities, most peaceful communities in the country was destroyed in less than 18 hours.
In a span of 24 hours, the thriving Black community, Greenwood, Tulsa, once full of doctors who owned clinics, businessmen and women who ran firms, families living in grand styles, so many standard schools, churches and all, was brought down into ruins. Thousands of individuals were left homeless, hundreds killed, bodies dumped in mass graves. As the smoke cleared, the true extent of the devastation became clear. Over 35 city blocks were destroyed, more than 1,200 homes reduced to ash, and an estimated number of 300 lives lost. The survivors were left to pick up the pieces, their lives forever changed by the trauma of that day.
I never thought I'd see the day when my community would be destroyed. It was like the world was coming to an end.
Says Ruth Avery, a survivor of the Tulsa destruction.
After the massacre, we made our church more fire retardant. So we put stucco, and you'll see it now, and it's still there. We put stucco on the basement because obviously folks didn't have a problem burning down places of worship. The folk who did that still to this day got away with murder. None of them were charged with a crime. This church was rebuilt not because our insurance paid us our claim. It was rebuilt because the members came and paid. It was not because the city or state or the nation said we were wrong. And one thing I hope people take from this is if America truly values law and order, if America truly values all of her citizens, then why can't America give justice to all of her citizens?
And just like that, Black Wall Street was erased, not just from Tulsa, but from history books for nearly a century. Its history silenced, its legacy lost until now. As we delve fully into the happenings of that day, we'd like you to support our efforts by subscribing to our channel if you're yet to. Like and share this video to as many as you can across the globe so you too can join the community of those helping to revive the long hidden histories of the Black race. Now let's get back to the heart-wrenching story of how a once lively and thriving community was brought into ruins in one day.
Tulsa is a boom town built on oil and oil wealth. And the prospect of oil wealth attracted Black people as well as whites. And so Tulsa had, as a whole, maybe a couple thousand people, right, in 1905. By 1921, there's roughly 100,000 people, right, in Tulsa proper. The groups that had been in Tulsa get dwarfed by the incoming migration of Black Americans from the South, as well as white Southerners who are coming to Tulsa in search of land, in search of wealth, to build that better life that we talked about.
As a booming oil city, Tulsa was known for supporting a large number of affluent, educated, and professional African American residents. Greenwood was a district in Tulsa that was organized in 1906 following Booker T. Washington's 1905 tour of Arkansas, Indian Territory, and Oklahoma. It was a namesake of the Greenwood district, which Washington had established as his own district in Tuskegee, Alabama 5 years earlier. Greenwood became so prosperous that it came to be known as the Negro Wall Street. So called because majority of the people living in the district were Blacks. Within the confines of the fast-growing Black neighborhood was a racially, socially, and politically tense atmosphere. Initially, the territory of northern Oklahoma had been established for the forced resettlement of Native Americans from the Southeast, some of whom had owned slaves. The slaves were the first Black inhabitants of Indian Territory, having been brought in by their native owners. These Black individuals had created their own businesses and services in the Greenwood enclave, including several grocers, 2 newspapers, 2 movie theaters, nightclubs, and numerous churches. Black professionals, including doctors, dentists, lawyers, and clergy, also served in the community.
The idea of Oklahoma as a place where Black people could, particularly who were fleeing the South, could reestablish themselves and go from, penniless sharecroppers to landowners. In 1906, O.W. Gurley, who's considered to be one of the founders of Black Wall Street, purchased a swath of land that would become the basis upon the Greenwood neighborhood, the Greenwood district. What we know in terms of the 1910 census, there were roughly about 1,000 Black people in Tulsa. By 1921, there are over 11,000 Black people. So they would have properties that were connected to each other, and connecting multiple properties together, they could begin to build an all-Black town. They could begin to build, a community.
The residents of Greenwood selected their own leaders and raised capital there to support economic growth. In the surrounding areas of northeastern Oklahoma, they also enjoyed relative prosperity and participated in the oil boom that as early as November 16, 1907, Oklahoma was admitted as a state. The newly created state legislature, which had a large Democratic majority, passed racial segregation laws, commonly known as Jim Crow laws, as its first order of business. The 1907 Oklahoma Constitution did not call for strict segregation. Delegates feared that the U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt would veto the document if they included such restrictions. Still, the first law passed by the new legislature segregated all rail travel, and voter registration rules effectively disenfranchised non-whites. This meant that they were also barred from either serving on juries or serving in local public offices. These laws were enforced until they were ruled unconstitutional after the passage of the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965, when major cities passed laws that imposed additional restrictions. On August 4, 1916, Tulsa passed an ordinance that mandated residential segregation by forbidding members of either race from residing on any block where 3/4 or more of the residents were members of the other race. Although the United States Supreme Court declared such an ordinance unconstitutional the following year, Tulsa and many other cities continued to establish and enforce segregation for the next 3 decades. Many servicemen returned to Tulsa following the end of the First World War in 1918. As they tried to re-enter the labor force, social tensions and white supremacist sentiment increased in cities where job competition was fierce. An economic slump in northeastern Oklahoma increased the level of unemployment. The Civil War, which ended in 1865, was still in living memory, and civil rights for African Americans were lacking. Shortly after, Tulsa had become a deeply troubled town. Crime rates were extremely high, and the city plagued with vigilantism, including the August 1920 lynching by a white mob of a young teen accused of murder. Newspaper reports confirmed that the Tulsa police had done little or nothing to protect most of these lynching victims, who are sometimes taken from jail cells at the county courthouse. By this time, the Ku Klux Klan had experienced a resurgence, fueled in part by the popularity of the 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation. Since then, the KKK had expanded its reach, establishing urban chapters nationwide. Oklahoma saw its first major KKK presence on August 12, 1921, marking a significant and ominous development in the state's history. By the end of 1921, 3,200 of Tulsa's 72,000 residents were Klan members, according to one estimate. And by early 20th century, lynchings were common in Oklahoma as part of a continuing effort to assert and maintain white supremacy. By 1921, at least 31 people, mostly men and boys, had been lynched in the newly formed state, of which 26 of them were blacks. At the same time, black veterans pushed to have their civil rights enforced, believing that they had earned full citizenship as a result of their military service. In what was later known as the Red Summer of 1919, industrial cities across the Midwest and Northeast experienced severe race riots in which whites attacked black communities, sometimes with the assistance of local authorities. The catalyst for the devastating event that led to Tulsa's destruction was a confrontation on Memorial Day weekend involving Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old old black shoe shiner, who was accused of assaulting Sarah Page, a 21-year-old white elevator operator. While the exact events that unfolded in the Drexel building on May 30th, 1921 remain uncertain, one account suggests that 19-year-old Dick Rowland had entered into an elevator operated by 17-year-old Sarah Page, a white elevator attendant. According to reports, a scream was heard a few minutes later by a white store clerk who immediately rushed to the scene, finding Page visibly distressed. Assuming that Rowland had assaulted her, the clerk called the police. However, the most widely accepted version of the story is far less sinister. It is believed that Rowland may have accidentally stepped on Page's foot while entering the elevator, prompting her to scream. Either way, the police arrived, but Sarah Page explained that Dick Rowland had simply touched her arm, startling her and causing her to scream. Based on her account, the police released Rowland. The next day, however, the Tulsa Tribune, the city's afternoon daily newspaper, reported that Rowland, who had been picked up by police, had attempted to rape Page. Moreover, according to eyewitnesses of that time, the Tribune also published a now lost editorial about the incident, titled "To Lynch Negro Tonight." By early evening, there was once again lynch talk were on the streets of Tulsa. Rowland would be arrested at his home in Greenwood and jailed at the courthouse. After the arrest, rumors quickly spread that he would be lynched, sparking widespread fear and tension. This was not an isolated incident, as the city had witnessed a similar atrocity just the previous year when a man was lynched, setting a volatile backdrop for the events that unfolded. Talk soon turned to action. By 7:30 p.m., hundreds of whites had gathered outside the Tulsa County Courthouse, demanding that the authorities hand over Dick Rowland, but the sheriff refused. At about 9 p.m., after reports of the dire conditions downtown reached Greenwood, that a mob of hundreds of white men had gathered outside the jail where Dick Rowland was being held, a group of approximately 25 black men. Some of them armed and mostly World War I veterans arrived at the scene. They went straight to the courthouse and offered their services to the sheriff and his deputies to help protect Rowland from the threat of lynching. The sheriff, however, assured them that the situation was under control and urged them to leave, insisting that Rowland would be safe in his custody. Believing the sheriff, the group of black men returned to Greenwood. Stunned and then enraged, members of the white mob would try to break into the National Guard armory, but were turned away by a handful of local guardsmen. At about 10 p.m., a false rumor hit Greenwood that whites were storming the courthouse. This time, a second contingent of African American men, perhaps 75 in number, went back to the courthouse and offered their services to the authorities. Once again, they were turned down. As they were leaving, an elderly white man approached O.B. Mann, a black man, and demanded that he hand over his pistol to him. Mann had refused, and the old man attempted to disarm him. A gunshot went off, and then, according to the sheriff's reports, all hell broke loose. Black Tulsans fought hard to protect their homes and businesses, with particularly sharp fighting occurring off of Standpipe Hill. Over the next 6 hours, Tulsa was plunged into chaos as angry whites, frustrated over the failed lynching, began to vent their rage at African Americans in general. Furious fighting erupted along the Frisco Railroad tracks, where black defenders were able to hold off members of the white mob. An unarmed African American man was murdered inside a downtown movie theater, while carloads of armed whites began making drive-by shootings in black residential neighborhoods. The shootings were so intense that they continued until midnight, in which time the group of black men, vastly outnumbered, were forced to retreat into the Greenwood district. As the chaos escalated, fires were deliberately set along the edges of Greenwood's thriving commercial area, marking the beginning of a calculated assault. Meanwhile, in several of the city's all-night cafes, groups of white residents began to organize and prepare for a full-scale invasion of Greenwood at dawn, setting the stage for one of the most devastating racial genocide in American history. At the end of the exchange of gunfire, 12 people were dead, 10 white and 2 blacks. Alternatively, another eyewitness account was that the shooting began down the street from the courthouse when black business owners came to the defense of a lone black man being attacked by a group of around 6 white men. It is possible that the eyewitness did not recognize the fact that this incident was occurring as a part of a rolling gunfight that was already underway. Irrespective of the different accounts, all amounted to one thing: violence had erupted in the courthouse, and civil officials selected many men, all of them white, and some of them participated in the violence, and made those men their agents as deputies. In that capacity, deputies did not stem the violence, but added to it, often through overt acts that were themselves illegal. Public officials provided firearms and ammunition to individuals, again, all of them white. As news of the violence spread throughout the city, mob violence exploded. White rioters invaded Greenwood that night and the next morning, killing men, burning, and looting stores and homes. Units of the Oklahoma National Guard also participated in the destruction of the city by arresting nearly all Greenwood's black residents. They moved them to other parts of the city and detained them in holding centers. Entering the Greenwood district, people stole, damaged, or destroyed personal property left behind in homes and businesses. The white people, some of them agents of government, also deliberately burned or otherwise destroyed homes credibly estimated to have numbered around 1,256, along with virtually every other structure, including churches, schools, businesses, even a hospital and library in the Greenwood district. The Tulsa police didn't help matters either. Instead of de-escalating the tension, they worsened the situation by deputizing hundreds of white residents, many of whom had been openly drinking and calling for Dick Rowland's lynching. These newly appointed deputies weren't trained officers, but angry white citizens handed badges and power. What followed wasn't law enforcement, it was chaos, fueled by prejudice and sanctioned by the very authorities meant to uphold justice. Reports have it that in less than 30 minutes, more than 500 men were deputized. The police and National Guard troops organized these newly deputized persons and other white Tulsans, many of whom were veterans with previous war experience, into martial forces. It was not a wild and disorderly mob, but an organized force that carried out a coordinated invasion at daybreak on June 1st, launched by a whistle, says a paper report from that period. Despite being numerically at a disadvantage, Black Tulsans fought valiantly to protect their homes, their businesses, and their community. Unfortunately, the city's African American population was simply outnumbered by the white invaders as they looted, burned, and destroyed over 35 city blocks. Many black families fled for their lives, leaving behind their homes and possessions, as white residents chased them across the city and looted their homes. The destruction of the district was total, and the government's inability to take adequate action to protect the Greenwood neighborhood ultimately led to its fatal destruction. Moreover, even when additional National Guard troops arrived in Tulsa at approximately 9:15 a.m. on the morning of June 1st, most of Greenwood had already been put to the torch. A brief period of martial law was followed by recriminations and legal maneuvering, even though Dick Rowland was later exonerated. An all-white grand jury blamed Black Tulsans for In the aftermath of the Tulsa race riot, federal investigators found out that the law enforcement, which includes Tulsa police and the National Guard, actively participated in the destruction. They did not only deputize the white residents of Tulsa to join in the fight, they also disarmed black residents, confiscated their weapons, and detained many in makeshift camps under armed guard. The federal investigators also found credible reports that at least some law enforcement officers participated in murder, arson, and looting. The reports noted that as many as 300 Tulsans were killed, perhaps even more. Investigators wrote that an accurate death toll may never be determined due to the haphazard disposal of bodies in the Arkansas River, on flatbed rail cars, and in unmarked mass graves, and because many survivors fled the city and never returned. According to the report, the Red Cross estimated that over 700 victims were injured in addition to the deceased. Thousands of black residents were left homeless. Tulsa officials promised to help Greenwood rebuild, but the city's government instead put up obstacles to residential reconstruction and imposed harsh new fire codes to prevent residents from rebuilding in the area. Survivors were left with little to nothing, but the city failed to offer meaningful financial or other help. The victims were never compensated for their losses, and none of the crimes committed were ever prosecuted or punished by any level of government, local, county, state, or federal. Ultimately, the responsibility for rebuilding Greenwood after its devastating destruction fell on the very people who had suffered from it. While the American Red Cross remained in Tulsa for several months to provide ongoing relief, led by the compassionate and committed director Maurice Willows, who carefully documented the events, the burden of restoration rested largely on the victims themselves. Even after order was restored, systemic racism continued to shape recovery efforts. It became official policy to release a black detainee only if a white person applied for their release and agreed to be responsible for their future conduct. Despite these obstacles, some individual white residents of Tulsa and neighboring communities did extend meaningful assistance to the victims, offering personal aid where institutions failed. The American Red Cross in particular stood out as a model of humanity in a time of immense suffering. Although the city and county governments covered much of the Red Cross's relief expenses, they offered little to no support for Greenwood's actual rebuilding. In fact, municipal authorities initially took active steps to block the community's restoration, further compounding the injustice already endured. Even after the restoration of order, it was official policy to release a black detainee only upon the application of a white person, and then only if that white person agreed to accept responsibility for that detainee's subsequent behavior. As private citizens, a few whites who were non-racist in Tulsa and neighboring communities did extend invaluable assistance to the mass killings victims, and the relief efforts of the American Red Cross in particular provided a model of human behavior at its best. Although the city and county government bore much of the cost for Red Cross relief, none of them contributed substantially to Greenwood's rebuilding. In fact, municipal authorities acted initially to impede rebuilding. The deep scars left by the tragedy remained visible for years. While Greenwood was eventually rebuilt, many families never truly recovered from the disaster. Moreover, for many years, the violence became something of a taboo subject, particularly in Tulsa. A state commission was formed in 1997 to investigate. The report recommended that reparations be paid to the remaining Black survivors. A team of scientists and historians also uncovered evidence supporting long-held beliefs that unidentified victims had been buried in unmarked grave sites. 100 years after the mass unaliving, 3 survivors, Mrs. Viola Fletcher, now 110 years old, her younger brother Hughes Van Ellis, who died in 2023 at 102, and Leslie Benningfield Randall, now 110, testified before Congress and called for local and federal officials to confront the truth about Tulsa's mass murder.
I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see Black men being shot, Black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see Black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams.
Mrs. Fletcher testified before a House Judiciary Subcommittee.
I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot.
Tulsa mass unaliving survivor Viola Ford Fletcher continues to call for justice. In her book, Don't Let Them Bury My Story, Viola Ford Fletcher shares her firsthand account of the Tulsa race annihilation and calls on all Americans to never forget the horrific events of 1921. The known survivors sued the city of Tulsa for covering up the attack, portraying Black victims as instigators of the violence, and profiting from the use of victims' names and stories while survivors and their descendants continue to live in poverty. As expected, the Oklahoma Supreme Court dismissed the suit. As we come to the end of this video, it is important to note that what happened in Tulsa wasn't just the destruction of buildings, it was the erasure of Black wealth, dreams, and futures. In one horrifying night, Greenwood, which once stood as a symbol of Black excellence, was reduced to smoke and silence. Unfortunately for them, they couldn't destroy the Black spirit, the courage, the truth. For decades, this story was buried, untaught, unspoken, and unheard. But today, we remember, not just the pain, but the power of those who dared to build something beautiful in the face of hate. The gruesome liquidation of Black residents in Tulsa was a brutal and deliberate act of racial violence, targeting only the Black community. It led to the loss of countless lives, the displacement of families, and the widespread destruction of homes and businesses. This tragedy was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of racial terror aimed at preserving white supremacy and stifling Black advancement in America. The lack of accountability and justice for these atrocities is a painful reminder of the ongoing struggle for racial equality and justice in America. Remembering and learning from these dark chapters in history is crucial for building a more equitable future. That brings us to the end of yet another video, and it was very heartwarming staying with us from the beginning till the end of this journey through Black Americans' painful past. We hope you found this episode informative and thought-provoking. Don't forget to support our works by hitting the thumb up button before you. Share video with your friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and kindly subscribe to stay tuned in to the channel always if you are yet to. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.